Okay, we are recording the lecture. Right. So today we are going to do the last teaching method, which isn't a method, that's really an approach. It is called as communicative language teaching. Okay, CLT being its abbreviation. But one thing you need to remember from the very beginning is that this method, is my mic working? Okay, one thing that you need to remember about this method is that this is not called as a method. Okay, and this is called as an approach, communicative language teaching approach, or just as CLT, communicative language teaching. But it's not a method. We are going to discuss the reasons for that. Another thing is that there are other methods also, but this is the method towards which all the other methods were working. And after this method, we come to eclectic approach, which is a combination of different methods, but this is the said to be the ultimate method, and which is very much in practice these days when it comes to applying the modern teaching methods. Okay, it came into existence in the 1960s and the 70s, but still um, this method had the most success rate, okay, as compared to the rest of the methods, because whenever we are doing a method, we see that it did not give the expected results, okay, which isn't the case with communicative language teaching, or CLT, right? Now, when I say that this is the last method that we are doing as far as the teaching methodology is concerned, but we will continue. I don't know if I've uploaded your um, course outline and the planner. We'll be doing more things other than the methods. Okay, we'll learn how to teach and the 4 skills separately, right? And how to evaluate those skills. We might also do some um, testing techniques of those skills. Okay, so coming to language teaching, communicative language teaching. Now, the origin of this CLT uh, is British, okay, and it came as a reaction of SLT, right? Remember this, that SLT was also a British method, okay, and SLT was developed simultaneously with audiolingualism, uh, which was different from SLT in its origin also, and in some other aspects too. But basically, communicative language teaching developed in Britain, okay, and it developed as a reaction to SLT, situational language teaching. Now, there perhaps were reasons for the failure of SLT. Okay, now what is the theoretical reason of the decline of SLT or the failure of SLT? Let's go to the chat. Let's go to the chat. My question is, reasons of failure of ELT. Get to your chat if you're up. Let's have some recalls from pre lectures. Come on, Adina, I'm waiting for your reply. And then there is Ayman also, Minal. Yes, what's the reason? Let's talk about, there might be many reasons, but what is the theoretical, excuse me, What is the theoretical reason of its failure? SLT failed in getting the desired results. Exactly. That's the simplest of the reason, because when audiolingualism was challenged on theoretical basis, its approach that took up the theory of behaviorism as its learning theory. So when that was challenged, the same thing happened in Britain also at the same time. So there the method did not get the desired results, and behaviorism was blamed for that. Okay, behaviorism as a theory, it got challenged by Noam Chomsky also. He was an American linguist, and he criticized the structural theories in his book, Syntactic Structures, okay, that he wrote in 1957. So because this theory was challenged in the US, so it was also challenged in Britain, and any method that was based on such a theory of rote learning or stimulus response chain or positive reinforcement and positive habit formation. So the method also suffered a decline for this reason. Okay. So basically, what was happening in situational language teaching was language was taught by practicing basic structures in meaningful situation-based activities. So as simple as that, audiolingualism suffered a decline and the theory was challenged. So also SLT suffered for the same reason. Okay, so when audiolingualism was rejected in the United States in the mid of 1960s, British applied linguists began to call into question the theoretical assumptions, as we have already said, that underlie situational language teaching. Okay, so now every method, and most of the method evolved because there was criticism in the previous practicing of that method. So it you need to remember that it came as a reaction for SLT also in audiolingualism in the US. Okay, so one theorist that you need to remember is of course Noam Chomsky. This person is still alive, and he speaks on a number of topics other than syntactic structures and linguistics. His lectures are available online. So British applied linguists, they emphasized another fundamental dimension of language that was inadequately addressed in these currently practicing language methodologies. Okay, let me admit some of your class fellows. So Noam Chomsky and other critics of the previous methods, they believed that some fundamental characteristics of the language were not being addressed. Okay, there were fundamental dimensions that were inadequately addressed in the approaches that were in practice. And they said that these dimensions were functional and communicative potentials of the language, right? So these critics, they saw the need to focus on language teaching, on communicative proficiency, and not on structures, right? So if you remember, in audiolingualism as well as in SLT, structures were focused, okay? Situations, events were also focused, but structures were also focused. So these critics, we would like to name a few also. They believe that learning of structures was not really functional. for the use of language. And also we have seen previously that most of the method aimed at making students or the learners of the second language communicatively competent. And we also found that they failed to do that. That's why there were other methods that evolved later on. So the target always remained the same, especially from direct method. Of course, the aims and objectives of grammar translation methods were quite different from the rest of the methods. But as far as other methods are concerned, most of them targeted communicative competence, which they kept on, researching and experiencing and experimenting, but it did not work. Okay, somehow it did not work. Sometimes it was a theory of learning, sometimes it was the theory of language, structuralism or a structural approach or a structural view of the language. That was blamed for not obtaining the results that were expected at the beginning of introducing or applying any of these teaching methods. Okay. So now let's talk about some of the proponents of this method who saw that the need to focus language teaching on communicative proficiency rather than, just mastering the structures. So we have some of the names, maybe you are familiar with Halliday. Halliday is very important because when we talk about the functional approach of language, he's the one who has given the functions of language. Okay. I don't know if you have done those functions in any of the other classes of linguistics or, discourse analysis or any such course, but Halliday is the person who talked about the functions of language. Like we talk about the functional approach to language. Other than him, there was a person, Widdowson. He has written many books, okay? And one of the books that we teach also, I think, for theoretical linguistics also, for syntax, okay? And then there was John Firth, and then there was Christopher Cantlin. Then other than that, these are the British ones. And then the American who criticized this method and, who were supportive of communicative approach were Delheims, Gumpers, and William Leboffs. So other than that, there were some fragmentations also. If you have done discourse analysis in some of your semesters, you must be acquainted with John Austin and John Searle. Okay. Are you acquainted with John Austin and John Searle? Have you done speech act theory? Let's get to the chat. Have you done speech act theory? Do you know John Austin? Do you know John Austin? Anyone who knows John Austin? Get back from your holidays now. Get back to work. Yeah. कौन सी theory दी है John Austin ने? Yes, Asma. कौन सी theory दी है? Yes, exactly. Speech act theory, right? So speech as action. Saying is doing. Okay, if you remember this theory, saying is doing and speech as action. So it talks about functionality of the language, how language functions actually. Okay, how language can be used to do different tasks and different functions in your daily activities, daily life, right? We're going to, while we would be defining communicative competence, we would look at this, and then we would look at Halliday's functions of language also. Okay, now speech act theory is part of your pragmatics. Okay, we also study this in discourse analysis, but basically it's a part of pragmatics, right? And I think you are also doing pragmatics this semester, right? Now, again, continuing with the background of communicative language teaching, it developed in Britain, and Britain, of course, you know that it lies in Europe. So what was the impetus? What actually made them work so hard to try to teach English as a second language? As we know about European Union, um, and we also know that there are many European countries who do not, where people do not speak English as their first or native language. Okay, and we also know that because of purposes of trade, education, tourism, exchange, all of this, they needed to learn another language. Okay, we also know that most of the countries of Europe, people are monolingual because their language is sufficient to get the things done. Okay, France is, you know, is monolingual. Italy, Germany, Britain by itself. Okay, then we have Scandinavian countries also. They have their own languages. So here, when you know they formed this, there was a European Council also. So it became very important for them to learn any language. It was not typically English as a second language. We talk about second language as English. The people were learning different European languages as their second language. Okay, so that was the need of accelerated research in language teaching methodologies because of certain educational realities in Europe, and there was interdependence of European countries. You know, they were interdependent on each other for the purpose of trade, for the purpose of education, tourism, also European common market as well. And then there was a Council of Europe, which was a regional organization for culture and education cooperation. So that was the time that a need was felt that people should be communicatively competent in whatever language they were learning. Okay, and there was a Council of Europe that published a lot of books about language teaching and was active in promoting the formation of International Association of Applied Linguistics as well, right? So now coming to, you know, what was the focus of this language teaching and why do we call it communicative language teaching? Now, I told you that it came as a reaction when students were unable to produce language communicatively. They knew the rules, but they could not use the language. Okay, so they needed to use the language in the social context. Now, Himes defines communicative competence. Communicative competence has at least 4 to 5 components. Okay, you need to be competent in a number of domains of language, right? But if we simply define, and please do remember this definition also, this is by Del Himes, 1971. When you know when to say something in the second language, how to say it, what are you saying, and to whom you can say. Okay, when you know, see, many people still, if you take your own examples also, many of you know the structures of language, many of you can talk in full sentences, many of you, you know, can even communicate. But when you are considered competent is the point when you know the actual use of language, because we know that there are different ways of talking to people. Okay, so when to say what, to whom, and how, this is your communicative competence. You should know, the formal and informal forms of language, the kind of vocabulary that can be used in different situations with different people. So that is communicative competence. Otherwise, what audiolingualism or what CLT was doing, it wasn't making people communicatively competent in the real sense. Okay. So they were in SLT, they were given situations and they were given patterns also to be used in certain situations. But different patterns can be used in one situation. Okay. We are going to experience a class also from Larson's book. We'll see how different patterns can be formed and can be used on similar or different occasions, right? So, okay, let me add few more of the students. Okay. Now, as I've already told you, this has been the goal of many of the methods, but they fail to do this, okay, for a number of reasons. Now, communicative language teaching goal is to, develop this communicative competence, okay, and this is to acknowledge the interdependence of language and communication. Language and communication are not two independent phenomena. Okay, language is for communication, and communication of course needs language, right? So but basically what you need to remember is that the goal of CLT, communicative language teaching, was to develop communicative competence. And this is Delheim's explanation also. Communicative, a person is communicatively competent when he knows when something is formally possible, formally said, if something is feasible to implement, if it is appropriate in relation to the context, whether something is in fact done. Okay, this is the similar definition as to knowing when and how to say what to whom, right? Other than that, okay. Now, let's talk about its approach, and that is very, very interesting. One thing you're going to do for your homework is to, I hope I'm audible. One thing you need to do about your homework is, in the beginning, I told you that CLT, communicative language teaching, is not a method. It cannot be called a method, but it is either called as an approach, or it is simply language, communicative language teaching. Okay, it is an approach, but it is not a method. What you need to find out, what's the reason. The rest of the methods, we call them methods. Okay, but this is not called as a method. It is called as an approach. Okay. Now, this approach basically takes a theory where language is communication, right? And I told you that this has become the most popular approaches of language teaching these days. Okay, and its bases are apart from grammatical, it takes up functional view of the language. Now, this functionality of the language is very important. Okay, and from the beginning also, we have said that the previous approaches were challenged, were questioned, because they were not covering this particular dimension in their language teaching, which is the functional and communicative potential of language. Okay, so that's why these critics they felt need to come up with a method that can make people functional in the use of language, right? You're doing this for your homework. It is an approach and not a method. Okay, just put it down. Before doing the theory, let me write down your question so that I do not forget by the end of this class. Why C why CLT is an approach and not a method. Okay, this is your question, and I may credit it. I'm not really sure, but I may credit that. Okay, now I told you that communicative competence is simply defined by Himes, but actually communicative competence is an umbrella term. Okay, and under this term there are many other competencies, right? Four at least. Okay, now whenever you're asked to define communicative competence, you need to check all these. Okay, if someone is communicatively competent, he will have grammatical competence in the language, and by grammatical competence we mean that he's able to use the grammar and vocabulary. Okay, so in grammatical competence we have two things: grammar and lexical capacity, right? The next competence is sociolinguistic competence. Okay, I hope you have done sociolinguistics also. So it is basically understanding the context to use the language. Okay, the social context to use the language, and here Delheim's definition fits in perfectly: what to say, when, and to whom. Okay, this covers your sociolinguistic competence, right? This the definition, or what I'm telling you about this competence, might be short. Okay, but these are really complicated, and these are really difficult to attain in a second language, right? Because it has sociolinguistic competence has within itself the culture implications also. You need to understand the culture and the language together. Okay, because it may happen, since we have learned English as a second language in a non-native environment, so it may happen when we interact with native speaker, the conversation may lead to misunderstanding or communication breakdowns. This would be because we might not be sociolinguistically competent in the language. Okay, we do not know what to say, when, and how. We might know the structures, we might know the sentences, but not knowing their culture, or and this also includes your body language when you're talking. So it's important that you in cross culture communication, basically it's not the failure of grammatical competence, but it is the failure of sociolinguistic competence. Okay, when the person is unable to use the language correctly socially. Okay, he may be right grammatically, he may be using perfect lexical or the vocabulary also, but he's unable to put the context in the right place. Okay, he's unable to realize the role relationships. Okay, then we have discourse competence, interpretation of individual message elements. Okay, Discourse, as we define, is anything beyond a sentence. So that is also, you need to, because when we talk about the functionality of the language, we do not talk about isolated sentences. So it's the interpretation of the message. Actually, function of the language is related not to the sentences, but to the message that is being tried to convey um, to the interlocutors, okay, or to the participants in that particular event. So discourse, the third competence that is required under the umbrella term of communicative competence is your discourse competence, that is interpretation of the messages and their elements, okay. Now, strategic competence is your pragmatic competence, right? In every culture, um, you need to know the small talks. If you have done fatigue communion, I'm not really sure. Fatigue communion is a topic of your pragmatics, okay, and it refers to small talks. And small talks in every culture are different. Now, what are these small talks of fatigue communion? Fatigue communion basically, you know, when people are sitting together in the Western culture, it is rude to stay silent. Okay, in our culture, it's okay if people are waiting in the at the airports, at the railway stations. If they are quiet, so we do not mind they being quiet. Okay, if we are waiting in the doctor's clinic and people are not talking to each other, that happens to be fine for us. But in some cultures, and in the Western cultures also, it so happens that this is rude if someone is quiet. So fatigue communion basically fills in that gap, okay. For instance, in British culture, we all know that's a matter of common knowledge that they talk about weather when they meet, okay. People can talk about weather to the strangers also, which is not the case in our culture. We usually do not talk to the strangers most of the time, but then sometimes people while traveling, they talk to each other as about their destination and as about their families and all that, jobs and things like that. But so what I'm trying to tell you that small talks of fatigue communion is different in different cultures, right? um, so this comes as a strategy. And then how do you start a conversation? It is different in our culture, it is different in the Western culture, okay. How would you start? How would you initiate? We initiate with the greetings, and we then inquire about the health of not that one individual, excuse me, of that one just wait. We do not just inquire about the health of that one individual, but we inquire after the whole family, which is not the case in other cultures, okay. So this is also, this comes in a strategic competence, that you need to know how can you start a conversation, what can you ask from a person, okay. In our culture, especially I'm not talking about the newer generation, but the older generation, they were really interested in people's personal matters also, and they would bluntly ask the questions that happen to be rude or considered to be rude in educated educated in modern cultures. So this is strategic competence, right? How can you start a conversation, what you can say, what can be used as a filler, what is accepted as small talks in a particular language. Of course, language is a part of culture. How do you end the conversation, okay? And how do you maintain a conversation if you want to, okay? So all of these have certain strategies of doing it, of starting the conversation, maintaining the conversation if you want to, terminating the conversation, adding small talks to it, adding fillers. All this comes in strategic competence, and this is the last level of competence. If you know these, the pragmatics of a language, then that means you're competent in that language. Okay. Otherwise, it will lead to miscommunication, bad feelings, and communication breakdowns, right? So, strategic competence also includes how do you congratulate people in a particular culture, right? What do you say at times of celebrations? Okay. When people are happy, how can you express your happiness? Okay. How can you console someone? How can you condole at someone's death? All of these are, strategic competence basically. Okay. What might be acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in the other culture, right? So whenever you are asked or whenever we talk about communicative competence, so you need to know these dimensions. Um, the shortest definition that Himes has given is also, covers all of these, but basically communicative competence is an umbrella term, and it has within itself four competencies. Discourse competence is one of them, grammatical competence, and these are basically levels. Okay, first of all, you need to know the structures of to know the language. Okay? You need to know the grammar also, to the extent of using it. Okay, because we in communicative competence we don't need to learn the grammatical rules of a language. Okay, and then once you know the structures, you know the patterns, and you're able to understand, then goes to the sociolinguistic competence, using the language in the society. You know your place, and you know people's place, and you know your role, and you know people's roles also, and you're able to talk in context. Other than that, in discourse competence, you are able to get the message and do the things. Okay. Now this is if I talk about Austin again, his speech act theory is a discourse theory. Okay, and that shows your discourse competence. If I ask you to, if I even indirectly ask you that I'm feeling thirsty, okay, so I have not asked you to bring me water. But if you have this discourse competence, if you have done this, about speech acts of a certain culture and language, would bring me water. If I say that the room is suffocating, you would go and open the windows. See, I did not ask you to open the windows, but you go and open the windows. So this should be the level of competence. Otherwise, if you just have grammatical competence and I tell you that the room is suffocating, you would say yes, it is. Okay, but if you have this discourse competence, you would go, you would open the windows, you would open the doors, whatever you can do to decrease the suffocation and let the fresh air get in, you would do that. Okay, and this is the strategic competence is the highest level of competence, and once you have a strategic competence, that means you're communicatively competent in the language. Okay, so in this communicative competence, you have you know how to start a conversation, how to end the conversation, how to maintain relationships and conversation if you want to. Okay, otherwise, if you do not want to maintain a communication, you should know the strategies also. Now, what is the approach and the theoretical basis? Basically, the theory is, communication itself is a theory. Language is communication. So its theoretical basis is that language is a system for the expression of meaning. There is no other function of the language than the expression of meaning. So language is meaningful. Language is functional and nothing else. Language is not structures. Language is function. Language is the expression of meaning. Okay. Language is just not lexicals, language is just not structures. So the primary function of language is interaction, you know. And of course, when you are interacting, you're communicating, right? So the focus of this method, as in many of the previous methods also, was communication, but not actually interaction. But here the primary function of language, according to CLT, is to make people interactive and to make them interact successful in their interaction and communication, to enable them to interact in that particular culture and to be able to speak the language that they have learned as a second language. I again repeat, in our context, we see it as English as a second language, but it is not necessary that English has to be the second language. People might be learning other languages, and we have already discussed that these methods and a lot of research was done on language teaching methodologies in Europe because of their interdependence on each other without a common language. They did not have a lingua franca. They needed to learn each other's language, and therefore they tried to devise the methods of language teaching and learning. Okay. Now, I've already told, we have talked about grammatical competence also. We also talked about structures. Okay. But here, the structures are also functional. The structures of the language should be functional and should have communicative uses. Those should not just stand as structures alone. Those should not be learned. Okay. And in this method, you would see that there is the students are not asked to learn anything. They're actually asked to use their critical thinking also, and to take out things from the given interaction, okay, as their homework and as their classworks. They are not asked to memorize anything, rules so bilkul bhi nahi, and then not even the structures. Okay, the proponents of this method do not negate the importance of structures in a language, but they change the perspective. They believe that structures should be for the function and use of the language. They should not just stand as structures alone in the language. Okay. So basically, the primary uses of language are the categories of functional and communicative meaning in discourse, right? So we're just going to quickly talk about, I told you that functionalism and the functions of language were given by Halliday, and this forms the basis of CLT. Okay. Now, okay, let's talk about the functions, not going to the definitions because definition describes the same functions. Okay, Halliday has given, 7 functions of the language. We'll just talk about, we just name this, and in tomorrow's class, we are going to do this in detail. And then we are going to move to class to experience English being taught through CLT. Okay. Some of the functions are, instrumental, regulatory, interactional, personal, heuristic, imaginative, representation. So he says that these are the functions of the language, and anyone who is using the language should be able to perform these, because he believes that language is function. If the language does not become functional for someone, if it is unable to do things for you, then that language is of no use. That means you're not using the language correctly. The only use of language, according to Delheim's also, and according to Halliday's functionalism, is that language should perform certain functions in the society. Okay, and if someone is unable to do those functions through the use of language, that means either the person has not learned the language correctly or he's unable to use the language. Okay, so that's why Jane Austen is one of the proponents from the US, who has her contribution in our CLT. Okay, who tells us that language is action, speech is action, saying is doing. Okay, if I ask someone to come in and he comes in without saying anything, that means what I said actually happened. Okay, if I say I'm feeling thirsty and you bring a glass of water, that means the language has done something. My language has, performed a function, a desired function. So we'll talk about this also. There are static functions of language also. It's just not about the actions, but Halliday talks about the static functions of the language as well. Okay, so I would like you to, read these functions also, but one thing you should do, and you should be writing in the chat section tomorrow when we meet, is to, what was the question that I gave you? Why CLT is an approach and not a method. Okay, you're going to search for this, read CLT, read Halliday's 7 functions of the language, okay, with examples. You're going to give me examples for the functions of the language also. So I think that's all for today. If you have any questions, you can raise your hands. Any questions related to the lecture? You can raise your hands, and I'm putting this recording on stop.